and welcome back to the channel. I'm Muriel, and in this video I will be doing my reading wrap-up for the month of May, during which I read a total of 9 books, 3 of them non-fiction and 6 of them fiction. Starting with the former category, I first read Angela Saini's The Patriarchs, a book I thought would essentially give me an updated and more multidisciplinary version of Gerda Lerner's very recently read The Creation of Patriarchy. So basically, an overview of contemporary research and theses on the origins of patriarchal or androcratic societal systems from varying but interrelated historical, archaeological, anthropological, etc. points of view. Unfortunately, this book's title turned out to be pure bait, and it is thus the most disappointing non-fiction I have read this year so far. Indeed, whilst I'll concede the book presents some older research on the topic with massive caveats I'll come back to shortly, you will not really get any sort of properly articulated current hypotheses regarding the origins of patriarchy, much less an overarching thesis like in Gerda Lerner's infinitely more engaging and scholarly treatise. My suspicions were quickly aroused as the Patriarchs' incredibly meandering and scattered structure became apparent to me. Ms. Saini wasted so much time describing contemporary patriarchal cultures and poo-pooing the baddies of Western colonialism for exporting their Christian, then capitalist patriarchy to the global South. And I've said this before, but I'll say it again. This information isn't going to be news to the vast majority of people interested in this topic, so what is the point of going over it again when you're supposed to be looking into the fucking origins of it all thousands of freaking years ago? And no, the couple of chapters that went into descriptions of some of the world's few remaining matrifocal societies did not compensate for the book's, yet again, spread too thin superficiality. Because just as with the relatively recent train wreck of a read that was period, Ms. Saini spent too much time including way too many details that weren't immediately relevant to the supposed topic at hand, instead of focusing on findings from various scholars and researchers that actually pertain to the subject of the emergence of patriarchy. This book was undoubtedly a work of pop science nonfiction in a bad way. I guess I've just grown used to more academic or scholarly publications because the absence of proper citation work really freaking bugged me in this one. All the more so given I know for a fact that Ms. Saini misrepresented some of the scholarships she cited in her book. More specifically, the way she talked about Lerner's book, which I just read, and her research exuded so much bad faith, it actively angered me. I honestly don't know if Ms. Saini read The Creation of Patriarchy in full at least, because she contended in The Patriarchs that Gerda Lerner had committed the cardinal sin of gender essentialism and stated women's subjugation was partly due to their weaker biological natures. But that is, respectfully, horseshit. What Ms. Lerner did in her treatise was look at several different factors which could have constituted necessary conditions for a gradual shift from primitive egalitarianism, or matrifocality, to male-dominated social groups, which then would have progressively coalesced into patriarchal state societies. Now, yes, some of those factors are biological, insofar as women are the human beings who bear, birth, and breastfeed children, which creates an inherent unequal division between the sexes in terms of reproductive labor. But that's materialist feminist theory 101, not gender essentialism, and it shouldn't be controversial in the slightest. Ms. Saini then went on to disagree with Lerner about the primacy of sex, as opposed to socio-economic class, as an axis of oppression, referring specifically to the historical relationship between marriage and slavery. Now, putting aside the question of which axis of oppression came first, since it is mostly a matter of speculation and opinion at this point, The hilarious thing is that Miss Saini followed her blanket disagreement delivered without any sort of supporting argumentation, mind you, with any copy-paste of Lerner's own development on the subject in The Creation of Patriarchy. I swear you can't make this shit up. So, yeah, my respect for Saini's work as a journalist was thoroughly shattered reading this book, because I've read something else by Angela Saini, and I liked the book I read, but now I'm kind of like, did you do your research properly in that one as well? Because, I mean, given the fact she did this, and given her book's lack of citations, how can I possibly trust she properly represented other scholars and researchers' work? Finally, the Patriarchs did this infuriating, woke, faux feminist thing of downplaying the very existence of patriarchy and sex-based oppression by not only being confusingly silent on the importance of humanity's, what I'll call, difference, that of sex, and the unequal division of reproductive labor that is inherent to our condition as gestating mammals, but also by watering down the actual meaning of patriarchy. I can't reference the exact quote, unfortunately, so take all of this with a healthy pinch of salt, of course, but the author more or less concluded her book with the idea that, well, patriarchy is just a system of oppression like any other, where some people have power over others. Some people, without any sort of unifying characteristic, apparently. Right. Here's my question. What is then even the fucking point of writing a book like this if we're going to, yet again, yeet sex class analysis out of the window, and thereby minimize the historical struggle of women for the recognition of our dignity as human beings in the face of, and liberation from, systems of male domination and privilege? I'm just so sick and tired of this shit. I really am. So this was a paltry 3.5 to 4 out of 10 read for me. I've already unhauled my physical copy of the book. I'll be generous and allow that if you've never, ever read anything about this topic, The Patriarchs isn't the worst book you could pick up as an introduction to it. But please, for the love of goddess, don't stop your exploration there, because at the end of the day, this really wasn't it. After that, I was thankfully able to cleanse my reading palette with Dreams Must Explain Themselves, a rather chunky collection of essays, talks, musings, and book reviews, and movie reviews actually, written by none other than Ursula K. Le Guin between 1972 and 2014, and which she personally selected and prefaced for this specific publication. Most of the texts in this collection focus on the nature of fantasy and science fiction literature, the challenges and joys of writing speculative fiction, genre snobbery, especially in academic literary discourse, the art craft of writing more generally, and considerations of sex and sexism in literature, and the arts more broadly. I skipped most of these sex and sexism-related texts, as I'd somewhat recently read them in Space Crone, and, well, for the most part, thoroughly enjoyed going through the rest of the collection, and engaging once again with Le Guin's brilliant, assertive mind, and, on the whole, well-articulated commentary. That being said, I actually disagreed fairly often with her thoughts on writing as an art form, or imagination in relation to childhood, for instance, and more so than I did reading Space Crone, I believe. I was also a little disappointed by the lack of nuance and wider knowledge she sometimes displayed, or seemed to display at any rate, in relation to the life sciences and social justice, shall we say. Her thinking felt a little too, for lack of a better word, American-centric at times as well. And I cringed every time Freud popped up in text, though in Le Guin's defense she mostly mentioned him to disagree with his thinking, as far as I could tell. Call it a knee-jerk reaction then. So no, this collection wasn't perfect for me, but reading it was still a pleasure overall. As such, I gave it a very strong 7.5 out of 10 rating, and would most certainly recommend it as much as I did Space Crone. After that, I read Woman's Law, written by Sarah Clegg. This non-fiction book presents the history of related, demonic, or demonized fantastical female figures such as Lilith, the Lamia, and mermaids from one of their hypothesized points of origin in ancient Mesopotamia with the rather scary goddess Lamashtu, up to the 20th century when most of these figures were reclaimed, to a certain extent, by feminist activists, artists, etc. And I really enjoyed this one overall. I appreciated the quality of the author's scholarship with proper referencing and citation work. Thank you. The, for the most part, tight focus of her thesis, and even the cheekiness she displayed at times in her commentary. I was already pretty familiar with the material in the book, yes, because mythology nerd, yet I learned a few new things despite that, so that was also a big plus for me. Now, given my prior knowledge, there are a couple of elements I found missing from the book which I think could have made its thesis feel more complete. I also would have enjoyed a bit more theological analysis or extrapolation in the text as well. With that being said, the author's main point concerning the nature of these figures as true elements of women's lore, culture, and history was beautifully articulated and supported by the evidence she provided in the book. Unfortunately, the book started losing some of its tight focus in its penultimate chapter on the Victorian era, and I think the author overstretched herself somewhat. The connections and conclusions she drew from previously discussed material didn't feel as solid as they should have, and I just felt there was a glaring gap in her argumentation. That, however, was nothing compared to the absolute train wreck that was the book's last chapter. Sorry. Mini-event incoming in 3, 2, 1. Why? Oh, why do non-fiction writers keep doing this? Why did there need to be an attempt at some sort of grand but largely unsupported connection to contemporary social justice stuff in a book already very clearly doing feminist scholarship by promoting a facet of women's religious and cultural history? Just why? If I felt the author overstretched her analysis in her chapter on the 19th century, it was so much worse in her chapter on the 20th and 21st centuries. Bloody hell. Because we left the delightful realm of tight but engaging exposition supported by material evidence to enter the rather unpalatable one of wild, only tangentially related speculation, and outright oversimplification or misrepresentation of information, examples of which included a paragraph on second-wave feminism that was atrociously bad, and a section devoted to Octavia E. Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy that was, actually, I don't even know what the fuck that was, quite frankly. It is so incredibly frustrating when books like these just do not stick to landing. Especially since Woman's Law's overarching conclusion, by contrast, was a perfectly fine summary of its very good main thesis. So, like I said, I really enjoyed this one overall, and I'm glad I have it as a reference in my nonfiction library. I gave it a 7.5 out of 10 rating, and would, yes, recommend this book to mythology, religious and cultural history nerds interested in female-centric material, but, you know, with the major caveat that its thesis kind of jumps ship in its last 2 chapters, unfortunately. Moving on to the fiction now, and starting with Arkady Martine's Rose House, one of the 4 books I've decided to read for this year's Hugo Awards, because I'm going to my first ever Worldcon this year. More on that later, maybe. So yes, Rose House. Ever wonder what a haunted house and murder mystery story would look like in a science fictional setting, where the ghost isn't, in fact, a ghost, but a house-wide artificial intelligence? Well, Rose House offers an answer to that question that I, on the whole, really enjoyed, actually. The novella format was just very skillfully utilized here. There was just enough world-building and thriller intrigue, at times bordering on psychological horror, to keep me engaged, and the lack of broader world-building or properly developed theming on the nature of the self, consciousness, etc., basically the kind of stuff you'd somewhat expect from an AI-centric story, didn't feel too frustrating, considering what I was actually given in terms of entertainment and single concept execution in the span of about 90 pages. And as to Ms. Martine's prose, I found it very smooth and decently evocative overall, and certainly fit to give an appreciably immersive sketch of her near-future setting. So all in all, this is definitely one of the better non-theming rich novellas I've read so far in my life. And I duly gave it a 7 to soft 7.5 out of 10 rating. After Rose House, I read another novella for the Hugo Awards, Thornhedge, written by T. Kingfisher. It is essentially, and per the author's own comments or afterward, a Sleeping Beauty fairy tale retelling that, to my mind, also pulls from The Frog Prince and sex swaps it, in which the main character is a woman named Toadling, who was exchanged with a changeling by fairies as a human child, and grew up to become a water fairy herself. And I enjoyed it for what it was. I found it very sweet, and like the relationship Toadling only really starts to develop with the tale's second main character, a knight. I am also thankful it didn't devolve into cheap, insta-lovey romance. Thank the gods for small mercies there. And the simple fact is I will always appreciate fantasy that pulls from real-world folklore, fairy lore, and fantastical creature lore like this one does. But there wasn't really anything beyond that to make this anything more than a pleasant little literary escapade. Nothing felt particularly impactful on an emotional level beyond that brief, candy sweet note, which was pleasant, yes. Nothing felt especially exciting or that fresh in terms of world building or folklore referencing, and I didn't find anything substantial in terms of theming. What Moves the Dead, which I read last year, I think, the one other story I've read written by T. Kingfisher, wasn't especially deep or imaginative either in terms of theming or greater world building, but its horror, reworking of Edgar Allan Poe's original material, so The Fall of the House of Usher, and fungal shenanigans, stood out to me a lot more, which is undoubtedly why I enjoyed it more overall, and thus rated it more highly. I think I gave What Moves the Dead a 7 out of 10, but Thornhedge was only a 6 out of 10 for me. Moving on to the novel-length fiction now, I first read The Rain Heron, written by Robbie Arnott, which opens with a fable about its titular creature, the rain heron, and how its impact on the weather impacted, in turn, the fortunes of a lone farmer sometime in the undefined past. This and the recurring nature-related imagery in the story are probably why I've also seen the rain heron called an eco-fable, more specifically. The book then follows a series of interrelated characters, a female hermit surviving in the mountainous wilds, a male military medic, and a female military commander at 2 different points in her life, whose lives are all affected by the legendary rain heron, or the people who wish to capture it and harness its presumed power. And it was basically a miss for me. Genre-wise, the rain heron counts as magical realism more than anything else, which I'm not a fan of, though it didn't grate on my nerves the way previously read magically realist tales have in the past. Still, the world-building in and speculative nature of this book didn't amount to much. The story takes place in the unspecified future, past a certain point of no return, it seemed, with regards to climate change, and in Tasmania, apparently. I figured it was Australia, given the mention of marsupial species, though there are marsupials in Tasmania as well, but no place name was otherwise provided in the text, so I guess it doesn't really matter in any case. There certainly was the titular rain heron, yes, and another somewhat fantastical creature, which I'll call the rainbow squid, the ink of which lends a feeling of super realism to paintings, amongst other things. The writing around those 2 animals was very evocative, and the descriptions of nature, of wilderness more generally, were beautifully evocative and immersive as well. But I wish the rain heron, so the actual animal at least, had been more immediately present and focal to the story. In a way, it just wasn't. Outside of that, well, this was a very meandering and rather empty-feeling story, unfortunately. I guess this one counts as character-driven overall, but that's only because the characters and attendant character work were just a little more front and center than the very bare-bones plot. This one was all about vibes, really. The theming, such as it was incredibly weak. somewhat unlike previous magically realist novels I've read, actually, funnily enough. Sure, the setting and aforementioned vibes reminded me at times of Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation and Into the Wild, the movie, but there wasn't anything I could really engage with beyond a very basic humans be too stupid and destructive to appreciate and harmonize with nature, and nature, for its part, doesn't give a shit either way and will carry on just fine without us, kind of. So, yeah. Beautiful nature-related descriptions, very evocative nature-related vibes, cool magical heron and semi-magical squid, and that's it. All in all, this one felt like a smooth, pretty-looking but mostly empty shell I quickly slipped off of, especially past part 2. Or, put more simply, a 6 out of 10 story worth reading once, but no more. After that, I read my first ever Naomi Novik, Spinning Silver, which was a gift from my bestest British friend, and which centers on Miriam, a young Jewish woman who, at the beginning of the story, takes over her father's money-lending business as her family falls on hard times. She does such great work, better work than her too nice father ever did, changing silver coins into gold ones, meant for the family bank account in the nearby town. She attracts the attention of a Starrick Lord, a kind of fairy essentially, who imperiously challenges her to turn his own silver into gold within a certain amount of time. If she doesn't, bad things will happen. The book also features 3 other points of view, but chiefly those of 2 other women. Wanda, a poor peasant who comes to work for Miriam in order to pay off her father's debt, and Irina, the daughter of a local lord fated to marry Menatius, the Tsar, and the fiery demon who inhabits him. Spinning Silver thus broadly works as a loose retelling or reimagining of the Rumpelstiltskin fairy tale set in Eastern Europe and mildly pulling from Slavic mythology. To start off with some positives, I liked the fact the story was as female-centric as it was, and that it worked very well as a mythology-infused fairy tale retelling. On a world-building front, I most certainly enjoy the fact Spinning Silver featured an Eastern European Slavic setting, and that it pulled from Slavic mythology for a pleasantly refreshing change. The novel's fairies, if you will, the Starrick, were also convincingly portrayed as non-human and otherworldly, or rather, what I'll term sub- or paraworldly, in the sense that they represented a different facet of the world and nature rather than a completely separate sphere of being. And this is, in fact, more in line with what fairies, elves, the she, etc. are supposed to be. And speaking of nature, I found the novel's highly atmospheric writing very compelling and immersive. Novik's prose, for its part, flowed smoothly overall, though I can't say I found it evocative or inspiring in any specific fashion either. Now on to some negatives. I'd say Spinning Silver was more or less equally character and plot-driven, which was fine, but it lacked greater world-building and certainly thematic depth beyond that, for me. There just wasn't much there, for me once again, to engage with on an intellectual or emotional level in terms of ideas, mythological referencing, or in terms of deeper character work and greater character relatability. At most, I can say Spinning Silver showed a character experiencing anti-Semitic discrimination, yes, and a sketch of intersectional oppression, since 3 of her 4 main characters were female and prejudiced in different ways. But I never got anything more than, well, a sketch, and would have preferred more substance and colour to be given to said sketch. I'm also not entirely sure the story needed all of its points of view, and this feeling honestly came as somewhat of a surprise since I'm generally a fan of multiple point of view stories. But it may precisely be because I felt the story lacked deeper substance. It didn't need so many character bones, as it were, given its lack of meat. The stories are animals in this metaphor, apparently. And the same kind of goes for the book's length. Not that it's a chonker either, right? But I'm not sure it needed to be quite as long as it was. Still, I'll allow that its compelling atmosphere largely made up for this feeling of paddedness. I am, unfortunately, a little more miffed about Spinning Silver's ending, which felt rough and rushed to me. I basically had to reason my way to it feeling like it fit, if that makes sense. Because sure, I suppose it could fit in a roundabout way, but it needed additional build-up, it really did. That being said, and despite that, the book's very last sentence, on its own, very specifically, resonated perfectly, so I'll happily give it that. Overall then, Spinning Silver was a slightly more positive than not, but ultimately mixed bag for me, which I rated a 6.5 to very soft 7 out of 10. That being said, I did like it just enough to give Naomi Novik's work another go, and will thus probably check out Uprooted at some point in the future. After that, I read China Miéville's Railsea. So, imagine Moby Dick, but instead of an ocean, you have a sea of rails, the Railsea, replacing great swaths of water from the Earth's, presumably continental shelves, uncounted decades or centuries into some sort of post-industrial collapse future. And instead of the great white whale, you have the great ivory moldywort, a basically big-ass, far-future mutated mole. And then, on top of that, you have a divided sky in which lurk, float, swim, a menagerie of eldritch critters that were dropped off long ago by relatives, no doubt, of roadside picnics, rather inconsiderate aliens. Pit-stop rubbish, as it were. That is the setting and setup of Railsea. It is, at face value, an absolutely ludicrous, far-future, and certainly far-fetched, post-apocalyptic setting, to be sure. It should, quite frankly, not work at all, and yet, Miéville fucking made it work because of course he bloody did. The world of Railsea is wonderfully weird, beautifully bonkers, and I had a whale, or should I say moldywort, of a time reading this novel. I'll venture so far as to say this might be the best non-obviously theming-driven or theming-rich novel I've read so far in my entire life. It's definitely ideas-driven, insofar as Railsea is all about its crazily imaginative but no less thoughtful world-building, but because its ideas are so family-channeled into sheer world-building and not theming per se, this one read more like a more purely entertainment-driven novel than anything else, which I found fascinating in and of itself. That being said, it was, yes, incredibly thoughtful entertainment because my mind delighted in thinking about the world of Railsea, its geography, its ecology, its human societies, its cultural customs, its megafauna. Miéville's prose was on point, as usual, and I once again loved the way he used language, or rather specific linguistic conventions, as a world-building device. Ampersands. Lots of ampersands. All of it had a lot of heart as well, and a plot that joyfully pulled me along for its wild ride. Yes, all of the puns are fully intended here. No, it didn't have super deep character work, and the plot unashamedly riffed off of, or I'd argue paid homage to, Moby Dick and the Strugatsky brothers, but you know what? I'll freaking allow it because it was bloody delightful. And because this was enthusiastic and loving imagination, creativity, and storytelling in the best sense of those words and concepts. This shit right here is why I love China Miéville's fiction, and so I gave Railsea a very strong 7.5 out of 10 rating. No. Indeed. Finally, in May, I read Jo Walton's Among Others, my first ever Jo Walton, and this one was a bit different. Genre-wise, Among Others barely qualifies as fantasy, but it didn't feel like magical realism to me either. Thank goodness for that. Still, it does this thing where you're never entirely sure if the fantastical elements are fully real or the result of the main character's fanciful perception of reality. Well, up to a certain point at least. As such, I would classify this novel as light domestic fantasy. Kinda like When Women Were Dragons, although I would argue the fantasy element in When Women Were Dragons is more just obviously real, or established as real in the narrative. Set between 1979 and 1980, Among Others, is written as the diary of a girl named Mori, short for Morwenna, a disabled teenager from Wales who lost her twin in a car accident and fled from her home, or rather her crazy witch of a mother, literally or not, that's up to you to figure out, to eventually land at the feet of her estranged father and his 3 sisters. From there, she is shipped off to boarding school in Shropshire, and stuff happens, somewhat. This book doesn't have much in the way of plot. It is very much a slice-of-life story, which is why the diary format worked perfectly for it. This also means, among others, is a character-driven story more than anything else. It is, additionally though, a story that pays homage to what I'll term bibliophilia, so just love of books and reading, SFF literature. So many real-life works and authors are name-dropped in the text, I kinda love that. And SFF fandom. I wouldn't say the theming was particularly deep in this novel, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't strongly vibe with the genuine love it expressed towards, well, books, reading, stories, and more importantly, speculative stories, and towards the creative communities that book lovers and nerds weave together. Among others, to my mind, also features a thematic motif centered on the magic inherent in everyday life. Like I said, the realness of the book's fantasy elements was left ambiguous for most of the story. Mori says she sees and talks to fairies, who speak Welsh. That was a nice touch, and I mean, you see this in the text. And that she and her twin used to play with them as children. Mori says she can do magic as well, but also that magic is always, conveniently enough, plausibly deniable. Parallels are repeatedly drawn to Le Guin's The Lathe of Heaven with regard to this point, which was another very nice touch. As such, magic and fairies can potentially be seen and understood through the lens of grief and alienation, since Mori has to come to terms with the death of her twin and struggles to fit in because she's different. Yes, I'll admit I kind of read her as neurodivergent, but your mileage will vary here to some degree, though I didn't relate all that much to her ultimately in terms of deeper personality, which was a little disappointing. Also, I'm twice her age, so that didn't help in terms of getting annoyed at her immaturity. I didn't really like the story's fantasy climax, and on the whole, its speculative elements lacked cohesion. Among others, in essence, had a promising but rather clumsily executed premise. Yet, it also held a certain sweetness, warmth, and gentle luminescence I found pleasant and relaxing. As such, it was a 6.5 to soft 7 out of 10 read for me, and definitely worth reading at least once. Oh, and yes, I'll probably try something else by Jo Walton at some point in the future as well. So that covers everything I read in the month of May. I hope you found this video, as usual, interesting, engaging, entertainment, all the good things. If you want to share thoughts, feelings, what have you about any of the books I mentioned in the video, you're more than welcome to do so in the comments down below. And on that very final note, well, for one thing, I hope you all had a good month of May, reading and everything else-wise, and I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for the continued support, and I shall see you all, hopefully, reasonably soon, in another video, but until then, bye-bye.